Angela, welcome to Rebels with a Heart. It's a pleasure to see you and have you on. I'm looking forward to our conversations as always, and I'm sure you will be an inspiring rebel today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Derek. It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, the pleasure is ours and the audience. So tell us a little bit, I mean, your career is amazing, but tell us a little bit about just what got you to embody this rebellious spirit in whatever way feels aligned.
Ooh, I like that question. So, at heart, I'm just a very non-traditional person. I question everything. I was one of the kids who got, talks too much on their report card and
that makes two of us.
And was always formulating kind of my own path. And I'm also an only child, so I think that has something to do with it. And so it's kind of been rebellious my entire life. And as I got into the area of employee engagement, human resources, that theme kind of just continued. So, putting human back in human resources has been a key theme. My background's in organizational psychology, so I really focus on behavior at work. And what I've found is workplaces weren't built for everybody, and we're really not taking into account the entire human. So I've spent a lot of my career questioning some of the things we consider just is or just as is and traditional in the workplace, and trying to make a better space for people to thrive and to fulfill their purpose in.
I love that. I love that you beat your own drum. And I think the questioning part is the key part of it. Questioning why things are done the way they are, and then being willing to take risks to try something new and different. And so what was it about HR specifically, or what was it about just in general, what industrial psychology, IO psychology, like what brought you to that path? Like, why did you choose that of all things?
Yeah, so I actually originally I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And then I said, you know what, I'm too much of a empath for this job. I will just soak all the trauma, and I still, we still work with trauma, I think, in workplaces, but it's a little bit more manageable for me, at least. So I had my mental health at top of mind when choosing my career, and I quickly realized that clinical psychology would be tough for me. So I discovered in the process of getting my bachelor's degree, I have a double major in human resource development and psychology. I had a mentor who kind of guided me into the path of workplace psychology. And I can only attribute that path to that one person, because that's what got me on that path. And that's usually what happens, right? And so I was like, oh, this is interesting. And, just viewing the organization as an organism and an ecosystem and thinking about the people in it really hit home and resonated for me. So that's how I got here.
I love that. And we're going to come back to a couple of things that you mentioned in that sentence. But when you first got into the actual business environment and saw this in practice, like, what were the questions that immediately came to your mind that said that you saw the chance to do it differently?
Yeah, I think, questions like, why is it that I'm the only one who looks like this in this room? Questions like, why are we making assumptions about the human experience that just didn't make sense to me? Why aren't we connecting the human experience to the full human experience to work versus expecting people to just bring their work human? Why aren't we considering their whole experience? These are things that I had noticed early on. And, also why aren't leaders doing their job? Why aren't leaders leading? So these are all things that, early in my career started, taking little Angela into account, when she was rebelling and talking too much, just continued right into my career. So never stopped.
I love that. That's kind of what I was getting at. And I love that you're willing to kind of push those hard questions to leaders and within organizations, both organizations that you've worked with and organizations you support. Talk with us a little bit about the work that you're doing now in terms of, helping organizations to, because you're doing a few different types of roles in what what you're doing now, how you're helping them to actualize these questions, helping them to really do it differently, not just ask it, but actually put into practice the work that is creating change, right?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, so I work as an advisor, a strategist with executives, leadership teams who are looking to navigate culture and actualizing it. And when I say actualizing, it's kind of getting away from the buzzword of, or the table stakes of, we need to treat our employees well. That's just table stakes. Now it's like, how do we actually work within the system to remove barriers, to match our organizational identity to our actual actions, to walk the walk, all these things. And it all comes back to, culture is just a culmination of your daily actions and behaviors. And culture is also your worst behavior of the company. So it's really about holding leaders accountable, but it's also about getting all the leadership team on the same page. So working and really giving some white glove treatment to that intact leadership team, because they're so important for change and transformation. So kind of two pieces to what I do is working with an executive team, working to define what is our aspirational culture and how do we work within process, behaviors, people, policies to move the needle. And then the second part of my role is working to build community with intact leadership teams, because they are the stewards of that work. And they actually are the ones who need to get it done and execute on it. So those are kind of the two layers I typically work the most with.
I love that. I want to come back to some of the back part of that, but you said something that was interesting to me about treating your employees well being table stakes. And that is true, I believe, but is it really true across all organizations, or is it something that, I think maybe in the organizations that you serve and we work with, that probably is true, but is it true across the broad context of the business right now? That's part A of the question. Part B is, what does it mean to you exactly to treat employees well? Like, what's the standard that we're creating for employers that may not be at that point yet?
Yeah, no, you bring up a great point. I think I'm jumping to the future a little bit here, because I think what we're seeing at the evolution around the social contract between employers and employees. Let me rephrase my statement. I think it is becoming table stakes, and it will be table stakes. And the opportunity for companies to get their shit together on it is narrow. Excuse my language. It's narrowing. I agree with you. Quickly. And so, the standard, I believe, is, are you treating people with empathy, respect, and considering their whole being and the whole human into the equation? Are you putting people over profit? Because the business case is, we know when you put people before profit, profit will naturally follow. But when you put profit before people, you lose people, attrition, people get sick, and that's just not good for your workplace or your business, but also the world and society. Yeah,
I agree with that philosophically, and that we've talked about this quite a bit. And I think that goes back to the second part, which is, as you're doing the work with the leadership teams, setting the models, setting the example, how are you bringing these concepts into the organization, infusing it within organizations to help them put the practices and put the behaviors in that actually merge good business performance, business performance in the historical sense, with putting people first, right? Because that's the part that I think we've seen. I wouldn't call it resistance, but slow adoption of leadership over the last couple of decades. And now, to your point, we've been gifted a major kind of quantum shift in how we conduct ourselves in the lens of business and work-life balance, and how we're negotiating our agreements around all these different things. And so what does that look like in the practical sense as you're kind of managing this change?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, I think there's a difference between commitment and being performative, and actually being absolutely committed and willing to make the change. So I'll just be frank and honest and blunt up front. I typically don't work with the organizations who are performative or their actions don't, at least an intention, match their commitments. I think where people typically need help from me is when they're like, look, Angel, this is where we want to go. We're really committed. We're willing to do whatever it takes, but we just don't know how. And so in practice, it is first really getting a gauge, like taking a beat and saying, where are we when it comes to the cultural elements of our organization? And I have kind of a diagnostic that I use. It's a mix of interviews, surveys to understand if this is where we want to go, what's currently happening in the organization, and do those things match? And what I'm looking for is disparity, right? So if we're saying we want to be an inclusive company or a diverse company, what do our policies look like that are driving that? Do we have a mix of diversity at the leadership level? I'm looking at data. I'm looking at quantitative and qualitative data to understand how those culture elements are actually matching up with where we want to be. And then we hone in on the gaps and we say, okay, these are our areas of opportunity. We say we're a wellness-driven company, they focus on well-being, but our people are saying, I don't feel like I'm psychologically safe here. So let's work on that. Let's get to tactics and specific programs, strategies to fix that element. And then there's, the engagement survey, right? So we have metrics and tools to measure this and benchmark this as we go to make sure that we're making progress and to continue to make sure all our investment and time is in the right place.
I love that. Thank you for getting very specific on the work that you're doing and how you're outlining it and how you're measuring it. I think that's the challenge, right? And I think that's the reality of HR right now. They're being challenged in a whole new way to measure this big idealistic opportunity, right? And that's the part where I think there's huge opportunity for people in this field to develop new ways of measuring productivity and what's important to employees and how, because I think, and we talked about this on our last conversation, is the blend and where individual responsibility meshes with leadership and company responsibility. And to your point, how we define that relationship. And I think and we've seen right now, we're seeing it on kind of a societal level being kind of played out, but it's those small interactions, those small relationships that happen every day they're kind of building up, right? And so it's a big problem. It's a big idea, big concept we're putting into practice. And it requires a lot of discipline and determination and perseverance, frankly, to keep going.
Yeah, and I think, I know what I kind of ran down sounded really complex and complicated, which is why someone may look to hire, someone like me or another culture consultant to say, okay, help us create a roadmap. But really, it's about consistency. Do your behaviors match what you're saying? It really comes down to leadership. It comes down to the quality of leadership. And so every company that I've worked with, it's typically the first thing we focus on is leadership, because what I find is the top of the organization, the executives say, this is what we want. But, those mid-level managers, maybe even directors, nobody's on the same page. Nobody knows the purpose of the organization. Nobody is living or role modeling the behaviors. So you got to really get that intact team, that community aligned before you can do really anything else with culture or wellness.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And what role specifically are you seeing wellness play in this right now too? Because I think that's another really interesting point that you bring up, is that separate from culture, we have this huge global pandemic that we're all managing from a reality standpoint, right? And so how is that variable changing the conversations that you're hearing on these topics around just overall inclusive cultures, sense of belonging, around value-based, business decisions, and that, how is that shifting the conversation?
Yeah, I think, I always consider wellness and DE&I actually a part of culture. I tend to not think about it separately. because typically if you look at any organization's core values or core behaviors, there's something around wellness. We treat each other with respect, or we care about people, or something like that. And then there's always something around inclusion or mutual trust and respect, or whatever it is. So I don't see them as programs. I see wellness and DE&I actually as it's a part of your culture. It's part of the culture you're looking to build. So, but what's changed, I think, is, back to that social contract. I think employees are saying, I am fed up with, I'm fed up, and I will no longer allow myself to be inauthentic in spaces, because it's causing too much energy and it's actually making me sick mentally, physically. And what are you, company, going to do for me? And that's a huge shift from companies, kind of looking at the employee and saying, how are you going to be loyal to us? How do we know you're loyal to us? Now the tables have turned completely. And I keep calling it the social contract, but that's what I mean by the social contract is the tables have turned.
I completely agree. I think we're just at the beginning of this kind of shift, right? Because truly, because you look at the conversations that you and I have had regarding wages, regarding benefits, regarding inclusivity. Right? I think we've been conditioned over a long time on how we look at shareholder-based capitalism, right? And the shift to stakeholder-based capitalism is a big one, right? And it requires different metrics of success, right? And also, I think the hard part is weighing, again, back, what is an objective standard versus what is people's feelings and emotions, right? And how to bring those together at what is truth, right? And how do you allow for a healthy conversation around that? And I think that's the part, my sense is that's the part that we're watching right now kind of unfold in the world and in the context of business is, what are people's opinions and emotions? How do those intersect effectively with what is optimal for business, for companies, for people, for communities, right? And I think that's the part it's hard to create a clear contract when that is not yet clear, right? So I think, what do you think about that, about the responsibility of HR professionals to help create that clarity on what is the expectation?
Yeah, it's really tough because, like you mentioned, we are at a very unprecedented, the buzzword, unprecedented time. So how do you separate between we're going through a crisis and separating that from once we're back to a new normal, how is the dust going to settle? And, I have a really rebellious philosophy on HR. I actually don't think that's the responsibility of HR. I think HR should be working themselves out of a job, and leaders should really be the pulse. And once you have that community of leaders, they should be coming together to have those discussions to say, what are you hearing? What are you hearing? Let's put this together. And maybe there's a facilitator, right, who kind of brings all the ideas together. Maybe that's HR, but there's got to be a responsibility from the leadership to not look at HR and say, what's the truth, HR? Actually, leaders, you're the ones who are on the ground. You're hearing, you're putting the pieces together. You're the stewards of the business. You know what needs to be done. So let's use that leadership community to understand what the truth is and to separate between short-term empathy and long-term empathy and what we need to do to actually get results.
Yeah, interesting concept. So as HR is working itself out of the job in a traditional sense, what are they transforming themselves into?
Yeah. So I imagine HR is working themselves out of a job. Leadership is really the drivers of culture. HR is really kind of a strategic advisory arm around road mapping the people and culture plan. So they're steering the ship, as far as which way to go, but the leaders are driving the ship.
Got it. So so in the sense of less process, less policy, less management of the implementation of those particular policies, more advisory of people strategy, or what aspect of it would you say?
Yeah, more business partnership, and really looking to the leaders to execute on key culture programs and key culture strategies. There may be, I could see some opportunity for, compliance management structure and keeping the integrity of the process and then iterating it and improving it. But the people who need to be at the forefront of, let's say, a coaching conversation, or really implementing wellness and well-being into their teams, needs to be the leader. Maybe there's some guidance or, consistent threads that we need to make sure connect back to that organizational identity piece, which that HR person can be, but it's the leaders who are executing it within their teams.
Awesome. And okay, awesome. And on a personal level, I know I'm giving you part. And that's a good transition point. So what, on a personal level, what are you passionate about outside of work? What's your identity outside of your work identity?
I love a lot of things. I love to travel. I always say I work within the lowercase culture, but I love culture, like the uppercase culture, learning about other cultures, learning about other people's experiences, traveling, experiencing the uppercase culture. And then my husband and I love to dance. We dance in our kitchen often, and we're usually the first ones on the dance floor at any party. So we both have a love. So
you like to have a good time.
Yes.
You like to have a good time. You bring your optimistic spirit into your HR world. That's what it sounds like. Absolutely. Amazing. Well, what's your one piece of advice you would share with our Rebel audience in terms of putting in their organizations, putting these ideas we've talked about? Where do they start? Where do they begin in that shift, that transformation, from HR in the traditional sense into, strategic advisors of the future?
Yeah, I think the big difference between traditional HR and strategic HR is solving a business problem. It's business partnership. And so it's not taking what you've gotten from SHRM and your best practice toolkit and saying, we're going to do this. It's talking, it's listening, it's understanding the challenges of the organization and the ecosystem, and using your people-centric lens to strategize on what to do next. So being a business ally, think about some questions you can ask yourself on how to be a better business ally.
Amazing. So, and do you think then it's important for us to be providing more education around how to add value to the business? Like, is that something that we should be really putting into practice for the HR field, is really understanding more how to define business outcomes?
Yes, 100%. Everything you do should connect back into the business outcomes. There should be nothing you're doing that doesn't connect into a business outcome. That's my perspective.
Awesome. Angela, as always, I enjoy our conversations, and I thank you for joining us today and sharing your wisdom